The auction block stood weathered and stained beneath the merciless Colorado sun, its rough-hewn planks bearing witness to countless transactions that reduced human dignity to mere commerce. Laura Lee clutched her infant daughter closer to her chest, feeling the baby's rapid heartbeat against her own racing pulse. The crowd of men gathered around the platform jeered and called out numbers with the casual cruelty of those who had forgotten that the trembling woman before them was more than livestock to be bartered. $50, called one voice from the back. 60, shouted another. Laura Lee's knees threatened to buckle as she stood there in her threadbare dress, the fabric torn at the shoulder from her desperate flight through the wilderness. Her husband's debts had followed her even here, to this godforsaken mining town where justice wore the face of whoever held the most gold. The auctioneer, a man with tobacco-stained teeth and eyes like chips of flint, raised his gavel. Going once for $60, he announced, his voice cutting through the mountain air like a blade. The baby in Laura Lee's arms began to cry, a thin wail that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. She whispered soft words to soothe the child, though her own voice shook with terror. From the edge of the crowd, a figure emerged. Benjamin Torres stood tall and broad-shouldered, his beard dark against weathered skin, his clothes practical and well-worn from years in the mountains. His eyes, deep brown and steady, fixed not on the auctioneer but on the woman holding her child. Something in his expression shifted, a recognition of shared humanity that the other men seemed to have abandoned. $200, Benjamin called out, his voice carrying easily across the square. The crowd fell silent, heads turning to stare at this newcomer who had just tripled the highest bid. Laura Lee's eyes met his for the first time, searching his face for some hint of his intentions. She saw no cruelty there, no predatory gleam, only a quiet determination that seemed as solid as the mountains themselves. The auctioneer's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. $200, he repeated, clearly struggling to believe his fortune. Any other bids? The silence stretched long enough for a hawk to cry overhead, its call sharp and lonesome. Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman for $200. Benjamin stepped forward, pulling a leather pouch from his coat. He counted out the coins with deliberate precision, each piece falling into the auctioneer's palm with a soft clink. Laura Lee watched this transaction that had just determined her fate, her mind reeling with questions and fears. Who was this man? What did he want with her and her child? The stories she had heard about mountain men painted them as wild and unpredictable, more beast than human. "You'll come with me now," Benjamin said quietly as he approached the platform. His voice held no command, only a statement of fact delivered with unexpected gentleness. He extended his hand to help her down from the block, and after a moment's hesitation, Laura Lee accepted it. His palm was rough with calluses but steady and warm. As they walked through the crowd, Laura Lee felt the weight of dozens of stares following them. Some of the men looked disappointed, others curious about this stranger who had so decisively ended their sport. Benjamin seemed oblivious to their attention, his focus entirely on guiding her safely through the press of bodies. The baby had quieted in her arms, perhaps sensing the change in her mother's tension. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and snow as they left the town square behind, but the story of how Laura Lee came to stand on that auction block began weeks earlier, in a place far from these peaks. The cabin where Laura Lee had lived with her husband, Edward Harris, sat empty now, its windows dark and door hanging open like a mouth frozen in surprise. 3 weeks before the auction, she had been a different woman entirely, one who believed in the promises men made and the safety that four walls could provide. Edward had been a dreamer, full of grand plans about silver strikes and easy fortunes, but dreams did not pay debts, and creditors cared nothing for the hopes that died with the dreamers. She remembered the morning when everything changed. Edward had ridden out before dawn, claiming he had business in town, but Laura Lee had seen the fear in his eyes, the way his hands shook as he saddled his horse. The baby, barely 3 months old then, had fussed through the night, and Laura Lee had walked the floor trying to soothe her while Edward paced like a caged animal. When the men came that afternoon, they brought news that would shatter her world completely. Edward Harris was dead, shot down in the street outside the saloon, where he had gone to beg for more time to pay his gambling debts. The leader of the group, a man with gold teeth and a smile like a knife wound, had looked around the modest cabin with calculating eyes. "This place and everything in it belongs to us now," he had said, his voice pleasant as if discussing the weather. "Including you, Missy, and that baby of yours. Seems your husband put up his wife and child as collateral for his last bet. Lost that one too, I hear." Laura Lee had felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "That cannot be legal," she had whispered, clutching her daughter closer. Edward would never do such a thing. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were lies. Edward had grown increasingly desperate in recent weeks, disappearing for days at a time and returning with wild stories about sure things and certain wins. "Legal or not," the man had replied with a shrug, "we have the papers right here, signed and witness proper. You can come willing, or we can make this harder than it needs to be. Either way, you belong to us now." The next hours had passed in a blur of terror and desperate planning. While the men made themselves at home in her parlor, drinking Edward's whiskey and discussing her fate as if she were not there, Laura Lee had slipped out the back door with her baby and what few possessions she could carry. The night had been moonless and cold, perfect for disappearing into the wilderness that surrounded their isolated homestead. For 2 weeks she had survived in the wild, moving by night and hiding by day, living on berries and stream water, while her milk slowly dried up and her baby grew thin and weak. The men had pursued her relentlessly, their voices echoing through the canyons as they called out promises of what would happen when they caught her. Laura Lee had pushed deeper into the mountains, following deer trails and creek beds, always moving higher and farther from civilization. But the wilderness was no place for a woman alone with an infant. As the days passed, Laura Lee grew weaker and more desperate. Her shoes fell apart, her dress tore on thorns and branches, and worst of all, her baby's cries grew fainter each day. She knew they were both dying slowly, but the alternative of surrender seemed even worse. The end came when she stumbled into a mining camp, half dead from exhaustion and exposure. The miners found her collapsed beside their stream, her baby barely breathing in her arms. They gave her food and water, but their kindness came with a price. Word spread quickly through the camp about the woman with the child, and soon the men who had been hunting her arrived with their legal papers and their cruel smiles. "We told you we would find you," the gold-toothed man had said as Laura Lee sat by the camp's fire, trying to coax her baby to take some milk from a tin cup. "Now you have caused us considerable trouble and expense. Time to make that right." The miners, rough men who lived by a code that valued strength above all else, had little sympathy for a woman who could not pay her husband's debts. They agreed to hold an auction, splitting the proceeds with Laura Lee's creditors. It was more civilized than simply handing her over, they reasoned, and it would give her a chance to end up with someone who might treat her well. Laura Lee had listened to these arrangements with growing horror, understanding that her fate was being decided by men who saw her as property to be divided and sold. She thought of her baby, innocent of all these adult failures and cruelties, and wondered what kind of world she had brought her daughter into. The night before the auction, Laura Lee had lain awake in the miner's spare tent, holding her child and whispering promises she was not sure she could keep. "I will protect you," she had murmured against the baby's soft hair. "No matter what happens tomorrow, I will find a way to keep you safe." Now, walking beside Benjamin Torres through the mountain town's dusty streets, Laura Lee wondered if those whispered promises had somehow summoned this quiet stranger to her aid. He moved with the confident stride of a man at home in wild places, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as if watching for threats she could not see. "Where are you taking us?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Benjamin glanced down at her and she caught a glimpse of something unexpected in his expression. Kindness, perhaps, or at least the absence of cruelty that had marked every other man she had encountered recently. "My cabin," he replied simply. "It is not far, and you both need food and rest." His words were economical, offering no elaborate explanations or false reassurances. Laura Lee found this honesty more comforting than any flowery speech might have been. The trail to Benjamin's cabin wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, following the curve of a creek that sang its way down from the high country. Laura Lee's legs ached with each step, her body still weak from weeks of deprivation. But she forced herself to keep pace with Benjamin's measured stride. The baby dozed fitfully in her arms, lulled by the rhythm of their movement and the sound of running water. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and cooler, carrying the crisp scent of snow that lingered in the shadowed places where sunlight never reached. Benjamin paused occasionally to let Laura Lee rest, offering her water from a leather flask without making her ask for it. His consideration felt strange after so many days of being treated as less than human. The cabin appeared around a bend in the trail like something from a dream. It was larger than Laura Lee had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney that spoke of careful craftsmanship. A garden plot beside the structure showed neat rows of vegetables, and a small corral held two sturdy horses that raised their heads to watch the approaching figures. "This is your home?" Laura Lee asked, unable to hide her surprise. She had imagined mountain men living in crude shelters, little better than caves. Benjamin's dwelling looked comfortable and well-maintained, a place where someone had taken time to build properly, rather than simply survive. "For the past 5 years," Benjamin replied, swinging open the heavy wooden door. He stood aside to let her enter first, a courtesy that seemed automatic rather than calculated. Laura Lee stepped across the threshold and stopped, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of being inside four solid walls again. The cabin's interior was clean and organized, furnished with handmade chairs and a sturdy table. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold but ready for lighting. Shelves lined the walls, holding books and supplies in neat arrangement. Everything spoke of a man who lived deliberately and took pride in his surroundings. "You can put the baby there," Benjamin said, indicating a wooden cradle that sat near the fireplace. Laura Lee stared at the piece of furniture, her heart catching in her throat. The cradle was beautifully made, its wood polished smooth, and its rockers carved with careful attention to detail. "Did you make this?" she asked, running her fingers along the cradle's edge. Benjamin nodded, suddenly seeming uncomfortable with her attention to his handiwork. "I carved it last winter," he admitted. "Thought someday I might have need of it." His words carried weight that Laura Lee did not fully understand, but she sensed loss beneath his careful tone. She placed her baby gently in the cradle, watching as the infant settled into sleep with a soft whine. Benjamin moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, building up the fire and setting a pot of water to boil. Laura Lee sank into one of the chairs, feeling her body relax for the first time in weeks. The warmth from the growing fire seemed to penetrate her very bones, driving out the chill that had settled there during her time in the wilderness. "Why did you buy us?" she asked finally, the question that had been burning in her mind since the auction. Benjamin paused in his preparations, his back to her as he considered his answer. "Because it was wrong," he said simply. "What they were doing to you, treating you like cattle to be sold. No woman should face that, especially not with a child." His words carried conviction, but no expectation of gratitude, as if he had simply done what any decent person would do. "But you do not know me," Laura Lee pressed. "I could be anyone, could have done anything. Why risk your money and your safety for strangers?" Benjamin turned to face her then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I know what it is to be alone and afraid," he said quietly. "I know what it means to have nowhere to turn when the world decides you do not matter." His voice carried the weight of personal experience, and Laura Lee sensed that his kindness came from his own encounters with cruelty. They sat in comfortable silence while Benjamin prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The domestic sounds of cooking filled the cabin, creating an atmosphere of normalcy that Laura Lee had not experienced in months. She watched him work, noting the careful way he moved, the attention he paid to every detail. This was a man who had learned to take care of himself completely, but his actions suggested he was equally capable of caring for others. When the food was ready, Benjamin served her a generous portion and waited until she had eaten before taking his own meal. The beans were well seasoned and filling, the cornbread still warm from the pan. Laura Lee ate slowly, savoring each bite while her body began to remember what it felt like to be properly nourished. The baby woke as they finished eating, her small cry cutting through the cabin's peace. Laura Lee moved to lift her daughter from the cradle, but Benjamin was there first, his large hands gentle as he picked up the infant. The sight of this rugged mountain man cradling her tiny baby with such care brought unexpected tears to Laura Lee's eyes. "She is hungry," Laura Lee said, reaching for her child. But Benjamin had already noticed the baby's rooting behavior and the way she turned toward Laura Lee with desperate instinct. "You have been struggling to feed her," he observed, his tone matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. Laura Lee nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. The weeks of poor nutrition and constant stress had taken their toll on her ability to nurse, and she had watched helplessly as her baby grew thinner each day. "I have goat's milk," Benjamin said, settling the baby back into Laura Lee's arms. "Fresh this morning, it will help until your strength returns." He moved to a wooden box that served as an ice house, retrieving a ceramic jug that he handled with careful attention to cleanliness. Laura Lee watched in amazement as Benjamin prepared a feeding solution, warming the goat's milk to the proper temperature and testing it against his wrist before offering it to the baby in a small cup. His movements spoke of experience, as if he had done this before, though Laura Lee could not imagine when or why a solitary mountain man would have learned such skills. The baby took to the goat's milk immediately, drinking with the desperate hunger of one who had been denied proper nourishment for too long. Laura Lee felt relief wash over her as she watched her daughter's color improve and her movements become more vigorous. For the first time in weeks, she dared to hope that they might both survive this ordeal. "You have done this before," Laura Lee observed as Benjamin cleaned the feeding cup with meticulous care. His hands stilled for a moment, and she saw pain flicker across his features before he composed himself again. "My wife and I, we had a child," he said quietly, not looking at her as he spoke. "A son. He lived only 3 days, but in that time I learned what a baby needs." His voice carried old grief, carefully controlled, but never fully healed. Laura Lee felt her heart clench with sympathy. "I am sorry," she whispered, understanding now why he had been moved to help her and her child. Benjamin nodded acknowledgement of her words but did not elaborate on his loss. "That was 2 years ago," he continued, hanging the cup on a wooden peg. "My wife, she could not bear the grief of it. She returned to her family in Denver. Said the mountains held too much sorrow for her." His matter-of-fact delivery could not entirely mask the pain beneath his words. "And you stayed," Laura Lee said, beginning to understand the loneliness that had shaped this man's life. Benjamin shrugged, his expression distant as he stared into the fire. "This is my home," he replied simply. "The mountains do not judge, do not ask questions about the past. They simply exist, and that is enough for me." His acceptance of solitude spoke of a man who had made peace with disappointment, though Laura Lee suspected the peace was more resignation than true contentment. As evening approached, Benjamin prepared sleeping arrangements with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. He offered Laura Lee his own bed, a comfortable-looking structure built into an alcove near the fireplace. When she protested that she could not take his sleeping place, he gestured toward a pallet he had arranged near the door. "I sleep lightly anyway," he explained. "Old habits from years of living alone in wild country. This way I can watch the door, and you can rest properly." His consideration seemed effortless, as natural as breathing, and Laura Lee found herself trusting this stranger in a way that surprised her. That night, lying in Benjamin's bed with her baby sleeping peacefully in the cradle beside her, Laura Lee stared up at the cabin's log ceiling and tried to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. 24 hours ago, she had been a hunted woman facing a future of unimaginable degradation. Now she lay safe and warm, her child fed and content, under the protection of a man who asked nothing in return for his kindness. She could hear Benjamin moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire and checking the door's heavy bar. His presence felt reassuring rather than threatening, a solid barrier between her family and the hostile world outside. For the first time since Edward's death, Laura Lee allowed herself to relax completely, sinking into sleep with the knowledge that someone else was standing watch. Morning came with the sound of Benjamin preparing breakfast and the baby's soft cries demanding attention. Laura Lee woke feeling more rested than she had in months, her body finally beginning to recover from the ordeal of the past weeks. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's windows, painting everything in warm golden hues that made the simple furnishings look almost elegant. Benjamin had already milked his goats and gathered eggs from the chickens Laura Lee had not noticed the day before. He moved around the kitchen area with practiced ease, preparing a meal that smelled wonderful and promised proper nourishment. The baby seemed stronger too, her cries more vigorous and her movements more animated. "How long can we stay here?" Laura Lee asked as they shared breakfast. The question had been weighing on her mind since she woke, the knowledge that this sanctuary could not last forever. Benjamin considered her words carefully before answering. "As long as you need to," he replied, his tone suggesting he had already given the matter considerable thought. But those men who were hunting you, they may come looking eventually. We should be prepared for that possibility. Laura Lee felt a chill run down her spine at the reminder of her pursuers. In the safety of Benjamin's cabin, she had almost forgotten about the gold-toothed man and his associates, but they would not simply abandon their claim to her. Edward's debts represented real money to them, and they would not easily accept the loss of their collateral. "What will you do if they come?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Benjamin's expression hardened, and for the first time she glimpsed the steel beneath his gentle manner. "Protect what is mine," he said simply, and something in his tone made it clear that he now considered her and her baby to be under his protection. The possessive phrase might have alarmed her coming from another man, but from Benjamin it felt like a promise of safety rather than a threat to her freedom. They spent the morning working together around the cabin, Benjamin showing Laura Lee how he managed his small homestead while she helped with tasks that did not require her to venture far from the baby. She learned that he kept goats and chickens, maintained a large garden, and hunted game to supplement his diet. His life was simple but self-sufficient, requiring hard work but offering independence from the outside world. As they worked, Laura Lee found herself studying this man who had so dramatically altered her fate. Benjamin moved with the confidence of someone completely at home in his environment, but she caught glimpses of loneliness in his quiet moments. He spoke little but listened carefully when she talked, his attention focused and genuine in a way that made her feel heard and valued. By afternoon, Laura Lee felt strong enough to venture outside the cabin's immediate vicinity. Benjamin led her to a small meadow where his goats grazed, carrying the baby while Laura Lee walked beside him. The mountain air felt clean and sharp in her lungs, a welcome change from the stale fear that had filled her breathing for so many weeks. The view from the meadow took her breath away. Mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, their peaks touched with snow even in the late summer warmth. The valley below showed patches of forest and grassland, all of it empty of human habitation as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful and wild and utterly isolated, a perfect hiding place for someone who needed to disappear from the world. "It is so peaceful here," Laura Lee observed, watching the goats move through the grass with lazy contentment. Benjamin nodded, his gaze following the line of distant peaks. "That is why I chose this place," he replied. "After the war, after losing Sarah and the baby, I needed somewhere quiet to heal. The mountains do not demand conversation or explanations. They simply accept whatever you bring to them." "You were a soldier?" Laura Lee asked, noting the way he had mentioned the war as a casual reference point. Benjamin's expression grew distant, and she saw him retreat into memories she could not share. 3 years with the Colorado Volunteers," he confirmed. "Saw enough fighting to last several lifetimes. When it ended, I could not go back to town life, could not pretend that everything was normal when nothing felt normal anymore." His honesty surprised her, this willingness to share pieces of his past without prompting. Laura Lee understood something about the need to escape from unbearable memories. Her own flight into the wilderness had been motivated by more than just physical danger. The life she had built with Edward, the dreams they had shared, all of it had been revealed as illusion when he gambled away their future and their safety. "I thought I knew my husband," she said quietly, adjusting the baby's position in her arms. "But the man who signed those papers, who put his wife and child at risk for a card game, that was not the Edward I married." Benjamin listened without judgment, his presence steady and reassuring. "People do desperate things when they are afraid," he replied. "That does not excuse what he did, but it might explain it. Fear makes cowards of good men sometimes." His words carried the weight of experience, and Laura Lee sensed he had seen such transformations during his time as a soldier. They walked back to the cabin as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The baby had fallen asleep in Benjamin's arms, lulled by his steady movement in the mountain air. Laura Lee felt a strange contentment settling over her, a sense of rightness that she had not experienced since before Edward's gambling debts began to consume their lives. That evening, as they shared another simple meal by the fireplace, Laura Lee found herself watching Benjamin with growing appreciation. He moved through his domestic routines with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, taking genuine pleasure in small tasks like preparing food and tending the fire. There was something deeply appealing about his competence, his ability to create comfort and safety through simple, honest work. "You are staring," Benjamin observed without looking up from his plate, though his tone held amusement rather than annoyance. Laura Lee felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed to be caught studying him so openly. "I was thinking," she replied, searching for words to explain her thoughts without revealing too much. "You could have bought anyone at that auction, or no one at all. Why choose someone with a baby, someone who would complicate your quiet life?" Benjamin set down his fork and looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious but gentle. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "And because I have learned that a quiet life can become too quiet, can turn into loneliness that eats away at a man's soul." His honesty took her breath away, this admission of vulnerability from someone who seemed so self-sufficient. Before Laura Lee could respond, the sound of horses approaching broke the evening's peace. Benjamin was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to a rifle that hung above the fireplace. Laura Lee felt terror flood through her as she recognized the voices calling out from the darkness beyond the cabin's windows. "We know you are in there," the gold-toothed man's voice carried clearly through the night air. "Come out peaceful-like, and we can discuss this like civilized people. But we are not leaving without what belongs to us." Laura Lee clutched her baby closer, feeling the familiar panic that had driven her into the wilderness weeks ago. But this time she was not alone. Benjamin stood between her and the door, his rifle held with the casual competence of a man who knew how to use it. His presence felt like a solid wall against the threatening voices outside. "Stay back from the windows," Benjamin instructed quietly, his attention focused on the sounds beyond the cabin walls. "Keep the baby quiet if you can." His calm demeanor helped steady Laura Lee's nerves, though her heart continued to race with fear. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see torches moving in the darkness, at least 4 men surrounding the cabin. They had found her sanctuary, had tracked her to this place of safety and peace. The thought of being dragged back into their cruel hands made her stomach clench with nausea. "Benjamin Torres," the gold-toothed man called out, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "We know who you are. Know you fought in the war. You are a respectable man, so surely you understand the importance of honoring legal debts. That woman and her child represent collateral for money owed. We have the papers to prove it." Benjamin moved to the window, keeping his rifle ready while he assessed the situation outside. Laura Lee could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a coiled spring ready to release. When he spoke, his voice carried through the cabin's thick walls with surprising authority. "I see 4 men with guns surrounding my home," Benjamin called back. "That does not look like a peaceful discussion to me. State your business in Pajranin or face the consequences of threatening a man on his own property." The gold-toothed man's laugh held no humor, only the cruel amusement of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "Mr. Torres, you paid good money for stolen goods. That woman belongs to us legally, and we mean to collect what is ours. Send her out with the baby, and we will leave you in peace." Laura Lee felt her world tilting again, the safety she had begun to feel crumbling, like sand. These men would never stop hunting her, would never accept that she might have value beyond what they could extract from her suffering. She looked at Benjamin's back, seeing the rigid line of his spine, and realized she could not ask him to fight her battles. "Maybe I should go with them," she whispered, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "You have done enough for us already. I cannot ask you to risk your life for strangers." Benjamin turned to look at her, and the intensity in his eyes made her step backward. "You are not strangers anymore," he said firmly. "You are under my protection, and I do not abandon those who depend on me." His declaration carried absolute conviction, as if the matter had been settled beyond any possibility of debate. Outside, the men were growing impatient. Their leader's voice took on a harder edge as he called out again. "We are done talking, Torres. Send out the woman or we will come in and take her. Either way, she is leaving with us tonight." Benjamin checked his rifle's load and moved toward the door. Laura Lee felt panic rise in her throat as she realized he meant to face 4 armed men alone. She caught his arm as he passed, her grip desperate and pleading. "Please," she whispered, "there are too many of them. They will kill you and take us anyway." Benjamin covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and steadying despite the circumstances. I have faced worse odds than this, he said quietly. During the war, I learned that sometimes a man has to stand and fight, regardless of the cost. Some things are worth dying for. His words carried the weight of absolute truth, and Laura Lee realized that arguing would be useless. Benjamin unbarred the door and stepped outside, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. Laura Lee crept to the window, her baby clutched against her chest, and watched through the gap in the curtains as he faced her pursuers. The torchlight painted everything in flickering orange and black, creating a scene that looked like something from a nightmare. "Gentlemen," Benjamin said, his voice carrying easily across the small clearing, "you are trespassing on my land and threatening my family. I suggest you reconsider your position." The casual way he claimed her and the baby as his family sent a shock through Laura Lee's system, though she had no time to examine her feelings about his words. The gold-toothed man stepped forward, his weapon drawn but held low. "Mr. Torres, you seem like a reasonable man. We are not here to cause trouble for you. Just hand over the woman and child, and we will be on our way. You can keep the money you paid. Consider it compensation for your inconvenience." Benjamin's response was to raise his rifle, the movement smooth and practiced. "The woman's name is Laura Lee, and she is my wife now. The child is my daughter. If you want to take them, you will have to go through me first." His lie about their marriage status hung in the air like a challenge, and Laura Lee felt her heart skip at hearing herself claimed so definitively. The tension in the clearing ratcheted higher as the four men spread out, trying to surround Benjamin while he kept his rifle trained on their leader. Laura Lee could see the calculation in their movements, the way they positioned themselves for a coordinated attack. Benjamin stood alone in the center of their circle, outnumbered but unbending. "Your wife," the gold-toothed man said with obvious skepticism. "How convenient. I suppose you have papers to prove this sudden marriage?" His tone mocked Benjamin's claim, but there was uncertainty beneath his bravado. The legal implications of Laura Lee's marriage would complicate their claim to her as collateral. "I have something better than papers," Benjamin replied, his voice steady despite the odds against him. "I have the right of a man to protect his family, and the will to use that right." His finger moved to his rifle's trigger, and Laura Lee saw the other men tense in response. The standoff stretched for long seconds, 4 against 1 in the flickering torchlight. Laura Lee held her breath, knowing that violence was only moments away. Then Benjamin spoke again, his words cutting through the night air like a blade. "You men served in the war?" he asked conversationally, though his weapon never wavered. "Because I did, and I learned something important during those years. A man who is fighting for something he loves is worth 3 who are fighting for money." The gold-toothed man's expression shifted, uncertainty replacing his earlier confidence. Something in Benjamin's tone, in the absolute steadiness of his aim, suggested that this mountain man was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The other men looked to their leader for guidance, their own weapons ready, but their enthusiasm clearly waning. "You are making a mistake, Torres," the leader said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "That woman is not worth dying for. She is just another man's leavings, damaged goods with a bastard child. Walk away and find yourself a decent woman, one who will not bring you trouble." Laura Lee flinched at the cruel words, but Benjamin's response came without hesitation. "You are wrong about her worth," he said firmly. "But even if you were right, it would not matter. A man protects what is his, regardless of what others think of its value." His defense of her sent warmth flooding through Laura Lee's chest, a feeling she had not experienced since the early days of her marriage to Edward. The standoff continued for several more tense minutes, neither side willing to back down, but both recognizing the deadly potential of the situation. Then one of the younger men, clearly nervous about facing a veteran marksman, began to edge backward toward the horses. His movement broke the spell of frozen violence, and the gold-toothed man noticed his companion's retreat. "This is not over, Torres," he called out, his anger clear despite his tactical withdrawal. "We know where you live now, know you have what belongs to us. We will be back with more men, and next time you will not have the advantage of darkness and position." Benjamin kept his rifle trained on the group as they mounted their horses, his stance never relaxing until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did he lower his weapon and turn back toward the cabin. Laura Lee met him at the door, her legs shaking with relief and residual terror. They will return, she said, stating the obvious truth that hung between them. With more men, as he promised. You cannot fight an army to protect us. The practical reality of their situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. Benjamin had won this battle through courage and skill, but the war was far from over. Then we will not be here when they return, Benjamin replied, already moving to gather supplies. We leave tonight, travel light and fast. I know places in the high country where they will never find us. His calm acceptance of the need to flee surprised Laura Lee, who had expected him to dig in and defend his home. But this is your cabin, your life, she protested. I cannot ask you to abandon everything you have built here. The thought of being responsible for destroying his peaceful existence added guilt to her already overwhelming emotions. Benjamin paused in his preparations to look at her directly. A cabin can be rebuilt, he said simply. A life cannot be replaced. Besides, I told you the truth out there. You are my family now, and family stays together. His matter-of-fact declaration of commitment took her breath away. They worked quickly to pack essential supplies, Benjamin moving with the efficiency of someone who had planned for such contingencies. He gathered food, ammunition, warm clothing, and tools, everything they would need to survive in the wilderness for an extended period. Laura Lee helped as best she could while managing the baby, who seemed to sense the urgency in the air and fussed intermittently. Within an hour, they were ready to leave. Benjamin loaded their supplies onto his 2 horses, arranging everything so that Laura Lee could ride while carrying her child. As they prepared to mount up, he handed her a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. What is this? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Benjamin's expression was serious as he explained. The money left over from buying you at the auction, he said, plus what I had saved for winter supplies. If something happens to me, you will need resources to take care of yourself and the baby. His practical planning for her welfare, even in the face of immediate danger, demonstrated a level of care that made her throat tight with emotion. Nothing will happen to you, Laura Lee said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. We will face whatever comes together. Her words seemed to please Benjamin, though he said nothing as he helped her mount her horse. They rode out into the darkness, leaving behind the cabin that had been Laura Lee's first taste of safety in weeks. The baby slept against her chest, lulled by the horse's gentle movement, while Benjamin led them up trails that were invisible to her untrained eyes. The mountains loomed around them like protective giants, their peaks outlined against a star-filled sky. As they climbed higher into the wilderness, Laura Lee found herself thinking about Benjamin's words to her pursuers. His claim that she was his wife had been a tactical lie, she knew, designed to complicate the legal situation and strengthen his position. But something in the way he had said it, the absolute conviction in his voice, had felt like more than mere strategy. The trail Benjamin chose wound ever upward through country that grew increasingly wild and remote. They traveled by moonlight, the horses picking their way carefully over rocky ground, while Laura Lee marveled at Benjamin's ability to navigate in near darkness. He seemed to know every twist and turn of the mountain paths, every safe place to rest, and every source of water. By dawn, they had climbed high enough that the valley containing Benjamin's cabin was no longer visible below them. They stopped to rest beside a small, alpine lake, its surface mirror smooth and reflecting the pink-tinged peaks that had surrounded them. The baby woke hungry, and Benjamin produced goat's milk that he had somehow managed to keep fresh during their night ride. How do you know these trails so well? Laura Lee asked as she fed her daughter. The isolation of their surroundings was both beautiful and slightly frightening. If something happened to Benjamin, she would be completely lost in this wilderness. I spent months up here after the war, Benjamin replied, checking their horses' hooves for stones. Needed time alone to sort through what I had seen and done. These mountains became like home to me, more familiar than any town or city. His explanation reminded her again of the depths she had not yet discovered in this quiet man. They rested for several hours, taking advantage of the daylight to sleep while the horses grazed on the sparse mountain grass. Laura Lee found herself studying Benjamin as he dozed, noting the way even in sleep he remained alert to their surroundings. This was a man shaped by years of vigilance, someone who had learned that survival depended on constant awareness. When they woke, Benjamin announced that they would continue climbing to a hidden valley he knew, a place where they could establish a temporary camp while deciding their next move. The afternoon's travel took them through country that seemed untouched by human presence, where eagles soared overhead and the only sounds were wind and water and the distant calls of wildlife. The hidden valley, when they finally reached it, took Laura Lee's breath away. It was a perfect circle of meadows surrounded by towering cliffs, accessible only through a narrow gap that would be easy to defend. A stream ran through the center of the valley, providing fresh water, and the grass looked rich enough to sustain their horses indefinitely. "This is incredible," Laura Lee said, dismounting carefully while balancing her baby. "How did you find this place?" Benjamin smiled, the first truly relaxed expression she had seen on his face since the confrontation at the cabin. "Pure accident," he admitted. "I was tracking a wounded elk and followed it through that gap. When I saw this valley, I knew it was special. I have been coming here ever since when I need to think or when the loneliness gets too heavy to bear." They set up camp near the stream, Benjamin constructing a lean-to shelter with practiced efficiency, while Laura Lee tended to the baby and gathered firewood. The domestic routine felt strange in such wild surroundings, but also oddly comforting. They were refugees from civilization, but they were together, and that seemed to matter more than their lack of permanent shelter. That evening, as they sat by their small fire and shared a simple meal, Laura Lee finally voiced the question that had been growing in her mind since their flight from the cabin. "What happens now?" she asked. "We cannot hide in the mountains forever, and those men will not simply give up their pursuit." Benjamin stared into the flames for a moment before answering. "There are options," he said slowly. "We could go to Denver, try to find legal help to challenge their claim on you. Or we could travel to California, start over where no one knows our history." His practical assessment of their choices revealed how much thought he had already given to their situation. "Both options require money and time," Laura Lee observed, "and both carry risks. The men hunting us have resources and connections. They might find us wherever we go." Her realistic appraisal of their difficulties did not discourage Benjamin, who nodded acknowledgement of the challenges they faced. "Then we make our own option," he replied. "We stay in the mountains, build a new life where they cannot reach us. I know how to survive here, how to build and hunt and live off the land. It would not be easy, but it would be free." His proposal hung between them like a bridge to an uncertain future. Laura Lee considered his words while she watched the baby sleep peacefully in her arms. A life in the wilderness would be hard, full of dangers and deprivations that she could barely imagine. But it would also be a life of their own choosing, free from the debts and obligations that had destroyed her previous existence. "You would do that?" she asked quietly. "Give up any chance of returning to civilization? Live as an exile for the rest of your life?" Benjamin met her gaze across the fire, his expression serious but certain. "I have been in exile since the war ended," he replied. "The difference would be that I would not be alone anymore." His honest admission of loneliness touched something deep in Laura Lee's heart, a recognition of shared isolation that she had not expected to find. The next morning brought a discovery that changed everything. Benjamin had risen early to scout their surroundings, a precaution that proved wise when he found fresh horse tracks near the valley's entrance. Their pursuers had not given up the chase, and they were closer than anyone had expected. "We have maybe half a day before they find this place," Benjamin reported grimly as he returned to camp. "The tracks are from yesterday evening, which means they are moving fast and following our trail with more skill than I gave them credit for." Laura Lee felt the familiar chill of terror, but this time it was mixed with something else: anger. These men had already destroyed one life she had tried to build, and now they threatened to destroy another. She was tired of running, tired of being prey in someone else's hunt. "What if we stopped running?" she asked, surprising herself with the words. Benjamin looked at her sharply, clearly not understanding what she meant. "What if we faced them, but on our terms instead of theirs?" "You are talking about a fight," Benjamin said slowly. "4 armed men against one, with you and the baby to protect. Those are not good odds, no matter how we arrange the confrontation." His practical assessment was accurate, but Laura Lee had been thinking about more than simple combat. "Not a fight," she replied, her mind working through possibilities. "A trap. They expect us to keep running, to stay on the defensive. What if we gave them what they think they want, but made sure the cost was higher than they were willing to pay? Benjamin studied her face, seeing something there that had not been present before. The frightened woman who had stood on the auction block was gone, replaced by someone who had found her own strength in the crucible of survival. "You have an idea," he said, and it was not a question. Laura Lee nodded, her plan taking shape as she spoke. "They want me because I represent money to them, a debt to be collected. But what if collecting that debt became more expensive than the original amount? What if they had to choose between cutting their losses and risking everything for a principal?" She outlined her idea while Benjamin listened with growing admiration for her tactical thinking. It was dangerous, requiring them to split up and expose themselves to capture, but it offered something their previous plans had lacked: the possibility of ending the pursuit permanently rather than simply postponing it. "You understand what you are proposing?" Benjamin asked when she finished explaining. "If this goes wrong, you and the baby could end up in their hands with no way for me to help you." His concern was genuine. But Laura Lee had already weighed the risks against the alternatives. "If we keep running, they will eventually catch us anyway," she replied. "At least this way we choose the time and place of the confrontation. And if it works, we win our freedom completely instead of just buying time." Benjamin was quiet for several minutes, considering her proposal from every angle. Finally, he nodded slowly. "It could work," he admitted, "but it requires perfect timing and a lot of luck. If either of us makes a mistake, we both pay the price." They spent the morning preparing for what might be their final confrontation with Laura Lee's pursuers. Benjamin checked his weapons and selected the best defensive position in the valley, while Laura Lee prepared herself mentally for the role she would have to play. The baby seemed to sense the tension in the air, fussing more than usual and requiring extra attention to keep quiet. The plan was simple in concept but complex in execution. Laura Lee would allow herself to be captured, but only after Benjamin was in position to control the situation. Her apparent surrender would draw the men into the valley where Benjamin could engage them on favorable terms. The key was making her capture look accidental rather than deliberate, which required acting skills she was not sure she possessed. As the afternoon wore on, they could hear horses approaching through the narrow gap that led into the valley. Benjamin kissed Laura Lee gently, a gesture that felt like both blessing and farewell, before disappearing into the rocks above their campsite. Laura Lee was left alone with her baby, waiting for the moment when she would have to trust her life and her daughter's future to a plan that could easily go wrong. The gold-toothed man appeared first, his weapon drawn and his eyes scanning the valley for threats. Behind him came his three companions, all of them alert and ready for trouble. They had learned caution from their previous encounter with Benjamin, and they approached the campsite with careful attention to potential ambush points. "Well, well," the leader said when he spotted Laura Lee sitting by the coal fire with her baby. "Looks like your mountain man finally abandoned you after all. Smart choice on his part, really. No sense in dying for another man's property." Laura Lee forced herself to appear defeated and resigned, though her heart hammered against her ribs with fear and adrenaline. She clutched her baby closer, playing the role of a helpless woman abandoned by her protector. The performance felt disturbingly easy, drawing on the genuine terror she had experienced during her weeks of flight. "He left during the night," she said quietly, allowing her voice to shake with what the men would interpret as despair. "Said he could not risk his life for someone else's troubles." The lie came smoothly, supported by her body language and the apparent evidence of Benjamin's absence. The gold-toothed man relaxed slightly, though he continued to scan the surrounding cliffs for signs of an ambush. "Can't say I blame him," he replied with cruel satisfaction. "Mountain men are practical folk, not given to romantic gestures when the stakes get too high." He gestured for his companions to spread out and search the immediate area. Laura Lee watched the men move through their campsite, noting how they positioned themselves and where their attention was focused. Benjamin had chosen his hiding place well, she realized. Even knowing where to look, she could not spot him among the rocks and shadows above them. "Time to go, Missy," the leader announced when his men finished their search. "We have wasted enough time chasing you through these mountains. You are coming back with us to face your obligations, and that baby of yours will learn early what happens to children whose parents cannot pay their debts." The casual cruelty in his words ignited anger in Laura Lee's chest, but she forced herself to remain passive and compliant. She stood slowly, cradling her daughter and moving toward the horses directed. Every step felt like walking toward her own execution, but she trusted in Benjamin's plan and his ability to execute it at the crucial moment. The men began to relax as they prepared to leave the valley, their prize finally in hand and no sign of the mountain man who had caused them so much trouble. Their leader even allowed himself a smile of satisfaction as he contemplated the profit that Laura-Lee and her child would bring. It was exactly the kind of overconfidence that Benjamin had predicted they would display. The attack came without warning, just as the men were mounting their horses. Benjamin's rifle spoke from the rocks above, and one of the pursuers toppled from his saddle with a cry of pain and surprise. The others scrambled for cover, but they were caught in the open with nowhere to hide from the elevated position Benjamin had chosen. "Drop your weapons," Benjamin's voice echoed off the valley walls, amplified and distorted until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You are surrounded and outgunned. Surrender now and you might live to see another day." His bluff about being surrounded was convincing, delivered with the authority of someone who had commanded men in battle. The gold-toothed man crouched behind his horse, his weapon drawn but useless against an enemy he could not see. "Torres," he called out, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Let's talk about this like reasonable men. We can work out some kind of arrangement that benefits everyone." "The time for talking is over," Benjamin replied, his voice cold as mountain stone. "You threatened my family and invaded my home. Now you face the consequences of those choices." Another shot rang out, close enough to the leader's position to send him scrambling for better cover. Laura-Lee used the confusion to move away from the men, carrying her baby toward the rocks where Benjamin was hidden. None of the pursuers tried to stop her, too focused on their own survival to worry about their prize. She had become a secondary concern in a fight that was rapidly turning against them. The wounded man was crying for help, his companions torn between loyalty and self-preservation. The gold-toothed man made the decision for all of them, calling out his surrender in a voice that shook with fear and fury. "All right, Torres," he shouted. "We give up. Just stop shooting and let us tend to our wounded." Benjamin emerged from his hiding place, rifle ready and eyes alert for treachery. He had positioned himself so that he could cover all four men while maintaining access to escape routes if the situation turned against him. His movements were precise and professional, those of a man who had survived similar confrontations through skill and preparation. "Leave your weapons and mount up," Benjamin commanded, his tone allowing no argument. "Take your wounded man and ride out of here. If I see any of you again, if you come anywhere near my family, I will not be so merciful next time." His threat carried absolute conviction, backed by the demonstration of his marksmanship and tactical skills. "This is not over," the gold-toothed man snarled as his men helped their wounded companion onto his horse. "That woman still owes a debt, and we have legal papers to prove it." Benjamin's response was to work the lever of his rifle, chambering another round with a sound that carried clearly in the mountain air. "Your legal papers mean nothing up here," he replied calmly. "This is my country, and my law is the only one that matters. Take your wounded and go, before I decide that letting you live was a mistake." The defeated men rode out of the valley in sullen silence, their leader's threats hanging empty in the thin mountain air. Laura-Lee watched them disappear through the narrow gap, hardly daring to believe that the nightmare pursuit was finally over. Benjamin kept his rifle ready until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, then turned to her with an expression of relief and exhaustion. "It is finished," he said simply, and Laura-Lee felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be free of it. The baby in her arms seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, cooing softly and reaching tiny fingers toward Benjamin's weathered face. "They will not return?" Laura-Lee asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Benjamin shook his head, his confidence based on hard-won understanding of men like their pursuers. "Men like that are bullies and cowards at heart," he explained. "They prey on those who cannot fight back, but they have no stomach for real danger. We hurt one of them and showed that we can hurt more. They will find easier prey rather than risk their lives for a debt that was questionable to begin with." Laura-Lee nodded, accepting his assessment while marveling at the change in their circumstances. Hours ago, they had been hunted fugitives with no safe haven and no hope of peace. Now they stood free in a hidden valley, masters of their own fate for the first time since Edward's death had shattered her world. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing her question from the previous evening, but with entirely different implications. They were no longer planning their next escape or calculating their chances of survival. They were free to choose their future based on their own desires rather than the demands of circumstance. Benjamin looked around the valley, his gaze taking in the meadow grass and the clear stream, the protective cliffs and the narrow entrance that could be easily defended. "Now we decide what kind of life we want to build together," he replied. "This place could support a small homestead if we are willing to work for it." "Together," Laura Lee repeated, tasting the word and finding it sweet on her tongue. "You still want us to stay with you even though the danger is past?" She needed to hear his answer, needed to know that his protection had been motivated by more than simple chivalry or temporary necessity. Benjamin set down his rifle and moved closer to her, his hands gentle as he touched the baby's soft hair. "I told those men the truth when I called you my wife," he said quietly. "Not the legal truth, perhaps, but the truth of my heart. If you will have me, if you can see a future with a man who has little to offer except his protection and his love, then yes, I want you to stay." Laura Lee felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. In this man who had bought her freedom and defended her honor, she had found something she had never expected to discover. Not just safety or security, but genuine partnership with someone who valued her for herself rather than what she could provide. "I can see that future," she whispered, shifting the baby so she could reach up and touch Benjamin's bearded cheek. "I can see us building a home here, raising children who will know only love and safety. I can see growing old with you in these mountains, far from the cruelty of the world below." Benjamin's smile transformed his entire face, revealing a warmth and joy that his usual serious expression kept hidden. He leaned down to kiss her gently, a promise of affection and commitment that sealed their unspoken agreement. The baby gurgled happily between them, as if approving of this new arrangement. They spent the rest of the day planning their future home, walking the valley and discussing where to build their cabin, where to plant crops, how to improve the natural defenses of their sanctuary. The work would be hard, the isolation complete, but they would face it together as partners in every sense of the word. As evening approached, they sat by their fire and watched the stars emerge above the valley's rim. Laura Lee nursed her baby while Benjamin played a soft melody on a harmonica he had produced from his pack. The simple domestic scene felt like a miracle after all they had endured to reach this moment of peace. "What will we call her?" Benjamin asked, nodding toward the baby who had fallen asleep in her mother's arms. "She needs a name that reflects her new life, her freedom from the circumstances of her birth." Laura Lee considered the question while she studied her daughter's peaceful face. "Hope," she said finally. "We will call her Hope because that is what she represents. Our hope for the future, our hope that love can triumph over cruelty, our hope that good people can find happiness even in a harsh world." Benjamin nodded approval of the choice, understanding the deeper meaning behind the name. "Hope Torres," he said, trying out the sound of it. "Our daughter Hope, born free in the mountains and raised in love." His claim of paternity for the child brought fresh tears to Laura Lee's eyes, this final acceptance that completed their transformation from strangers to family. The fire burned low as they talked quietly about their plans and dreams, their voices mixing with the sound of the stream and the distant call of nightbirds. They had found something precious in this hidden valley, something that all the gold in the mountains could not purchase. They had found home and family and the kind of love that makes any sacrifice worthwhile. When they finally sought their blankets, Laura Lee lay with her head on Benjamin's shoulder while baby Hope slept peacefully between them. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to the newest chapter in the eternal story of human resilience and hope. In the morning, they would begin the work of building their new life, but tonight they simply held each other close and marveled at the unexpected blessings that had emerged from their darkest hour. The mountain winds sang through the valley's entrance, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of challenges to be met and joys to be shared. Benjamin Torres had bought a woman and child at auction, thinking only to save them from a cruel fate. Instead, he had purchased his own salvation, finding in their love the missing pieces of his wounded heart. And Laura Lee, who had once stood trembling on an auction block with nothing but despair in her future, now slept peacefully in the arms of a man who valued her beyond price in a place where their love could grow as wild and free as the mountains themselves.